What if the most heavily guarded stretch of water on Earth is closed right now, and nobody in charge wants to admit how close things are to blowing up again? 6 demands just came out of Tehran, and Washington's answer might be the most dangerous kind of silence there is. Before we get into any of this, do one thing for me. Hit like on this video, hit subscribe if you're new here, and send this to one person who still thinks this story is over. This isn't over, not even close. Now let's get into it. It's August 2026, and the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway that roughly a quarter of the world's oil and a fifth of its natural gas used to pass through, is still not fully open. That sentence alone should stop you for a second. This is not some far-off conflict most people forget about after a headline. This is the artery of the global energy supply, and it has been squeezed for months. Let's go back to how we got here, because context matters more than ever right now. In February 2026, the United States and Israel carried out a set of coordinated strikes across Iran, hitting military sites, government infrastructure, and killing Iran's supreme leader along with several senior officials. That single event changed everything. It wasn't a symbolic strike. It was a decapitation of the regime's top leadership, something almost nobody expected to actually happen. Iran's response was immediate, and it was aimed at the one thing that could hurt the entire world economy at once. They shut the Strait of Hormuz. The Revolutionary Guard sent warnings over open radio channels telling every ship in the area that passage was forbidden. Tankers stopped moving. Insurance companies froze coverage. Shipping companies that had spent decades building routine schedules through that strait suddenly had nowhere safe to send their vessels. Within days, a war that started with airstrikes turned into an economic siege that touched every gas station and every shipping port on the planet. The United States didn't just watch this happen. By April, American forces launched their own campaign to reopen the strait by force. And within weeks, that turned into something bigger, a full naval blockade of Iran itself. Not a blockade to strangle the world's oil supply like Iran was doing. A blockade aimed directly at Iran's ports, at the regime's own ability to move money and materials in and out of the country. It was, in a strange way, Iran's own strategy turned back on itself. You want to choke global shipping? Fine, we'll choke yours. Since then, the numbers have been staggering. Dozens of commercial vessels redirected away from Iranian waters. Ships disabled, ships boarded, a handful even seized outright. According to American military estimates, this blockade has been costing Iran something in the range of $500 million every single day. Let that sink in for a second. $500 million a day, gone just from ships that can no longer reach Iranian ports the way they used to. And here's the part that a lot of people miss when they hear the word blockade. It's not one ship sitting in a doorway. It's layered. It's satellites tracking tanker movement from orbit. It's destroyers and support vessels sitting in defensive lines across shipping lanes. It's fighter jets flying overhead, cataloging every vessel that moves, cross-referencing it against known shipping registries, watching for tankers that quietly switch off their transponders to try to slip through unnoticed. Modern blockades are built on information as much as they're built on steel. And Iran, for all its threats, has struggled to find a way around that. Now here's where the story gets tense again, because just in the past few days, Iran's national security chief went on state media and laid out 6 demands. Lift the naval blockade, end every sanction, pay full compensation for war damage, withdraw American forces from the region entirely, stop all support for Iran's regional allies and partners, and release every frozen Iranian asset, no conditions attached. Read that list again slowly. This isn't a negotiating position. This is a wish list from a government that started this latest chapter of the conflict by closing an international waterway and attacking merchant ships. It's the equivalent of starting a fight, losing badly, and then demanding the other side pay for your medical bills and apologize on top of it. And the statement that came with it wasn't shy about the tone either. Iran's spokesperson said the country's leadership will not correct its behavior, essentially framing every demand as non-negotiable until Washington gives in completely. He went further, tying the entire list back to what he called months of steadfast resistance from the Iranian public, framing the demands not as a wish list from the regime, but as the will of the people. It's a familiar move. Wrap a government's survival strategy in the language of national dignity, and suddenly disagreeing with it looks like disrespecting an entire population instead of just rejecting a set of unreasonable terms. So how did the United States respond? Not with another wave of airstrikes, not with a dramatic television address. The response, if you can call it that, has been almost eerily patient. American officials have made it clear they're willing to let economic pressure keep doing the work instead of jumping straight back into open conflict. No rush, no panic. Just the blockade, staying exactly where it is, tightening a little more with every week that passes. That's worth sitting with for a moment, because it's a real shift in strategy. Instead of trading strike for strike, the approach now looks a lot more like a slow squeeze. Let the sanctions bite. Let the blockade keep working. Let the tankers keep turning around. Let Iran's own economy do the talking. It's less dramatic than fighter jets in the sky, but in some ways it might be more effective because you can't out-propaganda an empty bank account. If you're finding this useful, do me a quick favor and drop a comment with where you're watching from. It genuinely helps this video reach more people who need to see what's actually happening here instead of the surface level headlines. Let's talk about the ground reality of that blockade for a second, because the details are honestly wild when you put them together. American naval forces have redirected dozens of commercial ships in just the past few weeks alone, sending them away from Iranian ports entirely. A handful have been disabled, a couple have been boarded and searched. This isn't a one-time event. It's an ongoing, rolling operation that's been running for months without a single pause. Week after week, the same pattern repeats. New ships approach, new warnings go out, new vessels turn back toward wherever they came from. It's become almost routine, which is exactly the point. A blockade that runs quietly and consistently does more damage over time than one dramatic headline ever could. Then there's Karg Island, which most people outside the shipping and energy industry have probably never heard of. This one island handles roughly 90% of Iran's oil export revenue. It's not an exaggeration to call it the financial heart of the regime. And reports now suggest the loading berths at that terminal have been sitting empty for stretches of 10 to 20 days at a time. For an oil exporting nation, empty berths for that long isn't just inconvenient. It's a 5-alarm fire. Oil that isn't loaded onto ships isn't oil that gets sold. And oil that isn't sold is revenue that never reaches the regime's accounts. Think about what an oil terminal actually represents for a government like Iran's. It isn't just an economic asset. It's the fuel behind everything else the regime does, funding its military programs, its regional proxies, its internal security apparatus that keeps the leadership in power. When that terminal goes quiet, it isn't just a shipping story. It's a slow strangulation of the regime's entire operating budget, one empty berth at a time. Meanwhile, satellites have been catching tankers switching off their tracking transponders, a classic move used by vessels trying to disappear from monitoring systems while attempting to slip past the blockade. It rarely works for long. Between satellite coverage, aerial surveillance, and naval patrols working together, going dark on your transponder is more likely to draw attention than avoid it. It's the maritime version of turning off your phone's location while still driving past every traffic camera in the city. Now, here's the part of this story that actually reveals what's going on behind the scenes. While Iran's national security chief was publicly listing 6 demands the United States could never realistically accept, Iran's foreign minister was working an entirely different angle. He'd been telling the world that Iran and Oman were close to finalizing a deal, a legal framework for a new shipping route through the strait, one that Iran would control and regulate. Think about what that actually means. On one hand, you have hardline officials in Tehran publicly demanding the impossible, knowing full well Washington will say no. On the other hand, you have diplomats quietly trying to build something that looks legitimate on paper, something they can point to and say, look, we created an official system, we made a legal path for ships to pass safely. It's a 2-track strategy. Demand the impossible loudly so it gets rejected, then use that rejection to justify controlling the waterway unilaterally through a supposedly legal arrangement with a neighboring country. It's clever, in a cynical sort of way, but it's also incredibly transparent once you see both tracks laid out side by side. And here's the contradiction nobody in Tehran seems eager to address. Iran's foreign minister has said that reopening the strait depends on the United States compensating Iran for what they call violations of an earlier ceasefire agreement, a memorandum signed back in June. But that same memorandum was supposedly broken by Iranian attacks on tankers using alternate routes near Oman. So Iran is essentially demanding compensation for a supposed violation that happened after Iranian forces themselves had already been accused of violating the very same agreement. It's the kind of circular logic that only makes sense if your goal isn't actually resolution. Your goal is delay, distraction, and looking reasonable to outside observers while buying time. Because let's be honest about who Iran is actually performing this show for. It's not really for Washington, it's for the rest of the world. Every time Iranian officials talk about a legal mechanism or a new traffic route, they're hoping European governments, international shipping insurers, and global media outlets will look at that and think, well, at least they're trying to create order. It's a bid for legitimacy, dressed up as diplomacy, and it's worked before, historically, more than once. The question this time is whether the world is paying close enough attention to see through it. There's also a bigger, quieter story unfolding inside Iran itself right now, one that barely made international headlines but matters enormously. Iran's new supreme leader recently reshuffled the country's top military leadership, installing a new armed forces chief of staff, a new commander for the Revolutionary Guard, and a new naval commander for that same force. When a government rebuilds its entire military command structure in the middle of an active crisis, that's not a routine personnel change. That's a sign of instability at the very top, a leadership trying to consolidate control after losing its previous supreme leader and a wave of senior officials in a single set of strikes. The regime making these 6 demands publicly is, in some ways, the same regime that's still trying to figure out who's actually in charge behind closed doors. All right, quick pause here. If you've made it this far, you clearly care about understanding this stuff properly instead of just skimming a headline. So do me a solid, tap that subscribe button right now if you haven't already, because we cover stories like this the moment they develop, not weeks later when everyone else has already moved on. Let's zoom out for a second and look at what's happening around the edges of this conflict, because Iran and the Strait of Hormuz aren't operating in a vacuum. Other countries are watching, adjusting, and in some cases quietly repositioning themselves. Take the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, another critical global choke point further south. While Hormuz traffic has collapsed under the weight of this crisis, shipping through Bab el-Mandeb has actually picked up, with reports of well over 100 crossings recorded in comparable stretches of time. Some of that is simply rerouted traffic, ships trying to avoid Hormuz altogether and take the long way around. But that route has its own dangers too, with ongoing tension involving Houthi forces in Yemen, who have carried out their own separate attacks against certain vessels tied to regional rivals, particularly ships linked to Saudi Arabia. So even the alternative route isn't exactly calm water. Global shipping right now is basically choosing between 2 different flavors of risk, and neither one is safe. Then there's the broader question of who benefits from all this chaos, because, believe it or not every country is losing sleep over a disrupted shipping lane. Insurance markets that cover maritime routes through dangerous waters tend to see premiums spike when risk goes up. More risk, higher premiums, more revenue for underwriters willing to take on that exposure. It's an uncomfortable thought, but it's worth asking out loud. When a waterway becomes more dangerous, somebody, somewhere, is still making money off ensuring the ship's brave enough to use it anyway. And away from the Gulf entirely, other nations have been quietly repositioning their own military postures in response to how unstable global shipping lanes have become. Japan, for example, has been ramping up investment in advanced missile defense systems, contributing significant funding toward interceptor programs alongside the United States. When an ally starts putting real money into defense hardware at that scale, it's not a coincidence. It's a signal. Countries across the Indo-Pacific and beyond are watching how this Iran situation plays out because it tells them something about how seriously global choke points can be threatened, and how prepared they need to be if something similar ever happens, closer to home. Meanwhile, up near the Arctic, there have been reports of tankers under sanctions quietly using the northern sea route as a way to move cargo while avoiding traditional monitoring. It's a slower, colder, far less convenient path, but it's also far less watched. When the usual routes become too risky or too politically radioactive, some operators simply go around the entire map instead. It's a small story on its own, but it fits into a much bigger pattern. Sanctioned actors around the world are getting creative, and shadow shipping networks are becoming a bigger part of how sanctioned regimes try to keep their economies breathing. All of this ties back to the same core idea. And this isn't just a regional standoff between 2 countries anymore. It's a stress test for the entire global shipping and energy system. Every nation that depends on stable sea lanes, which is basically every nation on Earth, is watching how this plays out and adjusting their own strategies accordingly. A closed strait in the Middle East doesn't stay a Middle East problem for long. It becomes a fuel price problem in Europe, a shipping insurance problem in London, a defense budget problem in Tokyo, and a supply chain problem practically everywhere else. One more quick ask before we go deeper. If this video is teaching you something you didn't already know, share it with someone. Not because I need the numbers, but because most people genuinely have no idea how serious this situation has become, and they deserve to know. So let's ask the real question here. Why hasn't the United States just given Iran what it wants to make this whole thing go away? On the surface, it might seem simple. Lift the blockade, pull back some forces, let the oil flow again, and prices calm down everywhere. Wouldn't that be easier? Except it wouldn't be easier. It would be catastrophic, and here's why. Iran's 6 demands aren't really about ending a conflict peacefully. They're about restoring a regime's ability to project power without consequence. Lifting sanctions and unfreezing every asset without conditions doesn't lead to peace. It leads to rearmament. Iran's military leadership has been open about wanting to continue developing programs the international community considers deeply dangerous. Giving a regime like that a blank check, full financial access, and zero oversight isn't diplomacy. It's handing back the exact tools that led to this crisis in the first place. Think about it from a completely different angle. Imagine a criminal organization that's been extorting an entire neighborhood for years, finally gets challenged, loses badly, and then demands the neighborhood pay them reparations and promise never to interfere again. Nobody would call that a fair deal. They'd call it surrender dressed up as diplomacy. And that's essentially the shape of what Iran's national security chief just proposed on state television. This is also why the American strategy right now looks less like brute force and more like patience. Sustained pressure, applied consistently without dramatic escalation, is proving to be more effective at damaging Iran's ability to operate than another round of airstrikes might be. A country whose main oil terminal is sitting with empty berths for weeks at a time is a country whose government is running out of options. A country losing an estimated $500 million a day is a country whose leadership eventually has to choose between funding its military ambitions and paying its own soldiers, its own bureaucrats, its own basic government functions. That's the quiet brutality of economic pressure. It doesn't make headlines the way missiles do. It doesn't produce dramatic footage for the evening news. But it grinds. Day after day, it grinds down a regime's ability to function. And it does it without a single additional American life at risk on Iranian soil. History has shown, in more than one long standoff like this, that regimes under sustained financial strain tend to crack from the inside long before they ever admit defeat from the outside. The pressure doesn't need a dramatic final battle to work. It just needs time, and right now, time is exactly what the United States seems willing to spend. Of course, none of this means Iran is powerless. Even a weakened regime with an empty terminal and a battered navy can still cause damage. It doesn't take an aircraft carrier to threaten a commercial tanker. It takes a handful of armed drones and someone willing to use them. Iran has proven, painfully, through multiple violent incidents over these past months, that it can still make merchant shipping through that region dangerous, even while losing the broader strategic fight. Seafarers have died. Ships have been damaged and abandoned. Real human beings, people just doing their jobs on massive cargo vessels, have paid the price for a geopolitical standoff they had absolutely nothing to do with. That's the part of the story that's easy to lose in discussions about blockades and demands and military strategy. Behind every redirected tanker, every disabled vessel, every empty berth on Karg Island, there are real crews, real families waiting for news, real economic consequences rippling out to every country that depends on stable oil and gas prices. This isn't a chess game played on a map with no stakes. Every move here has a human cost attached to it, even when the news coverage reduces it to numbers and statistics. Most of these seafarers didn't sign up for a war. They signed up to move cargo, earn a paycheck, and get home to their families. Instead, some of them have found themselves caught between a regime willing to attack merchant ships to make a political point, and a blockade that, however necessary strategically, still adds another layer of danger and delay to their already difficult jobs. It's easy to talk about $500 million a day in economic pressure. It's harder and more important to remember that behind every one of those numbers is a person whose life has been disrupted by a fight they never chose to be part of. There's another layer worth understanding too, and it's one that rarely gets explained clearly. When a regime like Iran's loses the ability to fight conventionally, it typically doesn't just stop fighting. It shifts tactics. Instead of open military confrontation, expect more reliance on proxy groups scattered across the region, more use of low-cost drone attacks that are hard to trace directly back to Tehran, and more attempts to stir instability through allied militias rather than official state forces. This is the pattern that regimes under this kind of pressure tend to follow. When the front door closes, they look for every side door they can find. So where does this actually go from here? If history is any guide, and unfortunately with this region it usually is, expect the rhetoric to keep escalating in public while quieter negotiations continue somewhere in the background. Expect Iran to keep pushing the narrative that it's building legitimate legal frameworks with countries like Oman, hoping the rest of the world buys into that story faster than they scrutinize it. Expect the United States to keep leaning into pressure rather than provocation, at least for now, betting that a slow financial strangulation will force change faster than another round of open conflict would. And expect this to keep dragging on far longer than most casual observers expect. Wars that start with dramatic airstrikes and assassinations often end not with another dramatic strike, but with a slow, grinding stalemate that outlasts most people's attention spans. That's exactly why staying informed matters here. The moment the world stops paying attention is usually the moment the most consequential decisions get made quietly, without pressure, without accountability. There's one more piece of this puzzle that touches everyone watching this video, no matter where you live. Every time this crisis drags on, energy markets feel it. Fuel prices don't move in a vacuum. When a quarter of the world's oil and a fifth of its natural gas depend on a single strait staying open, uncertainty alone is enough to push prices around, even before a single extra barrel actually stops moving. But it's also far less likely to trigger the kind of global shock that a full-scale military escalation would cause. Sometimes the most responsible move a superpower can make is the one that looks the least impressive on camera. Before we get to the ending, one more thing. If you want to actually understand where this goes next instead of just reacting to whatever headline shows up in your feed, subscribe and turn on notifications. This story is going to keep shifting week by week, sometimes day by day, and most channels one that looks the least impressive on camera. Before we get to the ending, one more thing. If you want to actually understand where this goes next instead of just reacting to whatever headline shows up in your feed, subscribe and turn on notifications. This story is going to keep shifting week by week, sometimes day by day, and most channels are going to be weeks behind on the details that actually matter. Hard in international forums, trying to paint the United States as the side blocking a peaceful solution. Watch whether Iran and Oman actually finalize that so-called legal framework, because if they do, expect Tehran to lean on it hard in international forums, trying to paint the United States as the side blocking a peaceful solution. And watch Washington's tone. The moment patient pressure starts sounding less patient, that's usually a sign something behind the scenes has changed. In international forums, trying to paint the United States as the side blocking a peaceful solution. And watch Washington's tone. The moment patient pressure starts sounding less patient, that's usually a sign something behind the scenes has changed. Right now, nobody's blinking. The berths stay empty. The ships stay redirected. And somewhere in Tehran, a government that thought 6 impossible demands might force the world's hand is discovering that silence can be its own kind of answer, one that doesn't need to be loud to be absolutely unmistakable.